All right, with that out of the way, welcome to Virtual Face-to-Face with President Bruce Jarrell. I'm Alex Lakowski, Executive Director of Media Relations. None of us alone can save the nation or the world, but each of us can make a positive difference if we commit ourselves to do so. Now, many will recognize that passage from Race Matters, the seminal work of educator, philosopher, activist, and a lot more, Cornel West. Now, as agonizing as that book is to read for anyone who cares about social justice, his bottom line is optimistic. Working together, committed, we can make a difference. Well, here at UMB, we've had a lot to think about over the last year and a half in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion and what it means at this university. A year ago, June, at a town hall entitled A Social Justice Crisis in America, a campus community still reeling from George Floyd's brutal murder wrestled with what then Diversity Advisory Council Chief and panelist Elsie Steins called not a black problem, but an American problem. But while the panel addressed mainly the larger systemic issues, the audience in the chat session, I can tell you, was much more focused on fixing our community right here. I want UMB to acknowledge its complicity in systems of oppression, wrote one person. UMB can set a public example by examining its own biases and racist practices, not shying away from what is uncomfortable or inconvenient for it, wrote another. And there was this from a student. What avenues can students take to dismantle white supremacy within our respective schools, where we are often surrounded by students and professors who devalue us and ignore or downplay our experience? It's tiring to constantly have to justify your right to exist in institutions of higher education and professions that we have historically been excluded from. A lot to think about. And we brought in some great minds to help us do just that. Ibram Kendi talked with us about how to be anti-racist. To be anti-racist, he said, is to understand that the only explanation for racial disparity between groups is that there's something wrong with our policies, practices, or the conditions that certain people are forced to live under. And then to figure out which of those policies and practices are harmful and need to change. We saw and heard from author and educator Clint Smith, who asked us to look at history reconsidered. One can't fully understand the state of inequity we're in, he argued, without looking thoroughly at how we got here. And of course, not long after that town hall, you may remember a talk with Damon Williams, chief catalyst for the Center for Strategic Diversity, Leadership, and Social Innovation, and the author of some great books, the best-selling book, Strategic Diversity, Leadership, and Chief Diversity Officer. And Williams shared a lot of advice on how to create a strategic shift at a university like ours toward a more just and inclusive culture. One of the chief metaphors of his books, he explained, was the cheetah and the wolf, two styles for responding to crisis, in this case, a crisis of culture. Most universities, he said, respond with a flash of aggressive energy, attacking whatever issue pops up. But the wolf succeeds, he said, with relentless, collective, collaborative engagement. Now, Williams also argued that in order to be relentless in the pursuit of a strategic shift, universities would do well to appoint a captain devoted to that task. Now, just 5 days later, then interim UMB president Bruce Jarrell wrote this to the university community, that a national search had begun for a cabinet-level chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. We are committed to a culture that is enriched by diversity and inclusion in the broadest sense in its thoughts, actions, and leadership, he wrote. The CDEIO will be an advisor, leader, and catalyst for institutional change focused on DEI at the institutional level and will help us continue to advance DEI. So after what seemed like an eternity, but was really a little less than a year, UMB finally welcomed, as I encourage you to do now, our inaugural Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer, Vice President Diane Forbes Berthoud. Now, please be aware this program is being recorded and will be posted on the UMB homepage, umaryland.edu. Later in the program, you'll have a chance to ask your questions. Please don't be shy. This program is for you, so just write your questions in the chat area. And when it's your turn, I'll unmute your mic for you, so all you have to do is speak up. And with that out of the way, please welcome your host, UMB President, Dr. Bruce Jarrell.
Thank you, Alex. It's certainly a pleasure to be here and to again hear your warm voice. We are here today to hear from our inaugural Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and also Vice President. As we said at the time of George Floyd, that this individual would report directly to the president, and that's exactly the way it is. We also said another thing that was brought up in the chat session, which Alex didn't mention, and that is it's not good enough to have an officer. The officer has to have resources, and the wherewithal to assist in having change occur, not just through her own persuasion, but also through the persuasion of funding and people to help her with this. So I hope that we've done both of those, but I also know that we will continually be reassessing this in areas where we need to put more resources. That's what we'll do. So I look forward to that with Dr. Forbes Berthoud. Diane, let me welcome you here again. It's such a pleasure to have you here as part of our team. I know you've been very, very busy. I know that because you've been here in person and you've been meeting with a lot of people as well. I know you've had a lot of time to look at UMB from afar, and I know you've been gathering more up close information these last several months. Could you give us a preliminary report card on where you think UMB is in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion? Diane?
Thank you so much, President Jarrell. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, colleagues, for joining and listening in today. My pleasure to be here and to talk with all of you. So where is life at UMB as it relates to EDI? Well, my own research findings and my conversations with everyone reveal that our campus is very engaged, very committed, and I've been really impressed with the expertise and the talent on campus, specifically as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Lots of programs, speaker series, trainings, diversity committees. So I've been very encouraged by that because most campuses don't have that type of activity. What I think is certainly an opportunity, which is why I know my position in the office has been created, is in and around cohesion, building cohesion and a comprehensive picture. What does this then all mean? I've heard repeatedly, including in a meeting I had recently, you know, what you need to understand, Dr. Forbes, is there are a lot of silos here, or we're very siloed. That's a word that I've heard quite a bit from very early on in the year, before my hire, even until after. So there's an opportunity here to think about collective effort and how we can act more collaboratively in what we do related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then finally, for all the programs and activities that there are, as a strategist and an analyst myself, I would invite us to ask, to what end? What do these programs and activities produce? And what are those goals? And then have we assessed, have we met those goals as it relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion? So much more that could be said about that, but that's my initial read.
Great, thank you for that. So in your assessment, not only have you seen the breadth of problems and opportunities, but you've undoubtedly formed some kind of prioritization on what are the biggest or more impactful problems, or alternatively, where are the areas where we could get change to occur in a more rapid manner? Retention, recruitment, advancement. So how do you see the world of UMB in terms of the most impactful kinds of problems?
So I would first start with the data, and in order for us to make data-driven decisions and evidence-based strategies, develop those, I would certainly say that we stop and look for a moment at our data environment. We've collected lots of data on a number of different measures, some of which you've mentioned, like recruitment and retention, and we know by headcount who's here. I think we can strengthen that a bit more and make that process more transparent and accessible to more of our leaders so that we can then make decisions based on what's next. One of the areas that I have heard in multiple venues as well as seen in the data is the underrepresentation of diverse staff and diverse faculty in certain areas and at certain ranks. So both leadership for staff and diversifying leadership across our schools, and also the underrepresentation of particular racial, ethnic, and gender groups in the faculty groups. So that's an opportunity. And so thinking about faculty diversity and development, as well as diversifying staff at multiple levels, would also be a priority along with data.
Great, thank you. One of the things that I think has gained momentum here is that now almost every school, and soon to be every school, will in fact have an equity, diversity, and inclusion officer. Tell me sort of your view of how that's moving along, and what's going to be the relationship that you'll have with the officers in the school. How do you all pull together in common and dealing with common problems?
Well, I'll first start with my approach to understanding equity, diversity, and inclusion as it relates to this group and the work that we're doing broadly. Something that I want to mention here, I don't know if I've mentioned it this way in other fora, is the approach that I'm taking to EDI and to my work is that it is systemic, strategic, and sustainable. And I mention that because working with the DEI officers will help to advance all of those kinds of things, and it will help me to think and help us to think in terms of a system rather than dealing with one school at a time. So I'm hoping the DEI officers are listening, or some complement of them is listening. Very early on, I think in my first 2 or so weeks, I made it a priority to meet with them all as a group, which I've done at least 2 or 3 times. And I will meet with each at least once a semester. And for me, it is a learning relationship. It is networking. It is understanding what's happening in all the 7 schools, at this moment 5, and 2 of the schools that have yet to hire there. So they're on their way, which is great. And also an opportunity for me to share updates as well as seek their advice. So something that works in medicine may not work in law, something that works in social work may not work elsewhere. So here's an idea I have in and around training of search committees. I learned about the schools who were doing some of that training and beginning to build a resource that could be campus-wide and then adapted for context-specific areas. So certainly it is about learning and development. We're probably going to read a book together, and there's some professional development that we might do together or separately. So relationship building, learning, and networking for sure, so that we can understand that full system and be strategic about what happens next for sustainable change.
Okay, so when you're talking about the search committees, et cetera, you're talking at least about training and unconscious bias. What other kinds of things do committees need to be aware of in looking for a diverse panel of applicants for a particular position?
Well, we certainly need to be thinking about unconscious bias and what it means to be involved in inclusive hiring, to be aware of our biases around elitism, around affinity, around identity, and understanding how to put a search committee together. And this is actually pre the search committee stage. We also have to be thinking about where we place education and or experience in the lineup of assessing candidates. Sometimes we're such a stickler. I know we're in academic institutions. At times we'll say, well, it has to be a master's degree or nothing. But there might be others who have some college or a college degree and some experience, and that candidate is actually more qualified. And so really thinking broadly and comprehensively about how we assess candidates. In a faculty role, there are times that research about underrepresented populations is not valued in the same ways as other kinds of research. And so really thinking about those kinds of things when we train search committees to think holistically and deeply about each candidate and the qualifications for the role. So there are many, many other things, but unconscious bias, inclusive hiring, and also I think it's important to integrate our core values. Equity and justice is one subset of those core values. Well, how do those values relate to the search committee work? And asking those kinds of questions for discussion and during the time of the charge before actually being involved in that work. And one of the key things, we're often in a hurry, is to slow down. Slow a process down and to be strategic and thoughtful about what we're doing in a search. And there's so much great success that we can have with that.
Well, first of all, I'd like to remind the participants to get your questions in. This is your chance to ask Dr. Forbes Berthoud something that's on your mind and to get a straight answer. So please get your questions in promptly. I would appreciate it, and I'm sure she would too. You know, you talk about being thoughtful about the recruitment, and yet when you have a medical center and sick patients to care for, it gets very difficult to get a broad panel if my neurosurgeon left and I now have a big blank spot in my neurosurgery program and can't take care of these patients. Do you have any experience about how you get diverse applicants for some of these very hard to find and yet urgent to recruit kinds of positions?
Great question, Dr. Jarrell. And, my last 10, 11 years at my previous institution, there was a very large health center, health system, and academic medical programs. It is a challenge, and there is underrepresentation in the fields as well as in the positions that you mentioned. we have to ask ourselves as an institution, how important are these priorities to us? Because there's a way in which, kind of like not exercising or not doing particular healthy things for our body, we pay now or we pay later. And so what I mean by that is without taking the time for a diverse panel, without taking the time to do the kinds of recruitments and the pipeline building and development, that we lose the value of what we're doing here. And then we have a climate that's not as productive, not as inclusive, and people don't see themselves represented. So it does pay to stop, look, and listen, to take some time to think about, have we exhausted all of our possibilities? Did we look in the Midwest? Did we work with our minority serving institutions, with HBCUs, historically Black institutions? Did we work with undergraduate women's colleges and graduate programs that focus on women's issues? Did we work with HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions? Have we gone as deep and as wide as we could for a particular recruitment, as well as for the search committee composition? And in some cases, we may not have a search committee of 15. We may need to go with 10 or 8. And in some cases, it may take an extra month to look where we need to look for the candidates, as well as pay for memberships in some of these organizational affiliations.
Alex tells me we got a few questions.
Oh, great.
So Alex, fire at will here.
Okay, well, one of the issues that comes along with having faculty that is not as diverse as you would like is you don't have access to mentors. I'm going to bring in Miriam Laufer, who wants to explore that issue. Miriam, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Great. Thanks. Thank you so much. So I'm in the School of Medicine, and I recently took over the position of the director of the Office of Student Research. And I will say in the School of Medicine that admissions has done a really remarkable job in the past several years of improving the diversity of the medical school class. So we have great diversity within the class. My role is to help students to gain experience in research, which, honestly, in medicine is sort of part of the hidden curriculum. If you want to get into a competitive postgraduate training program, you need to have an outstanding research experience. And what we've found is that it's been very hard to, our people who are really working, excelling in research is not as reflective of is not representative of the class on whole. And part of the challenge is that students underrepresented students are looking to underrepresented faculty as mentors, and there are just so few. And I feel a little bit like the few that are there are really overburdened, and that sort of adds to the cycle of it, being difficult for them to succeed as faculty for them. And I sort of feel a little bit badly sending people to all the same faculty members. I wonder if you can sort of talk about mentorship and how to provide an inclusive mentoring environment without overburdening, a small number of faculty that we have at the School of Medicine.
Thank you so much for the question. And certainly, I'm sure you're aware, and many of our listeners are aware, participants, that this is not a unique UMB problem, and it's not even unique to higher education. So we have an uphill battle here. Among them, though, and the solutions and areas that we can work on, which is part of what we did in my previous institution, is working on, if possible, wherever possible, inter-institutional collaborations. So are there other med schools? Are there other professors? I think it's Michigan that has a program called Advance that UMBC has based some of its faculty development programs on. The reason I mention that is that program, Advance, and some others have a cohort of faculty in a leadership development program. And what faculty are asked to do and mentors are invited to be a part of are mentors who are similarly placed in terms of discipline. Maybe they are placed or similarly identified in terms of social identity, perhaps at a stage of their career, maybe it's by title. And so in any given, and this is an idea, and hopefully we can support something related to faculty leadership on campus that we can be involved in, at any given point, a person might have 2 to 3 mentors, not necessarily in their institution and not necessarily in their discipline. So that's an idea. And we also need more powerful allies, who, knowing that the numbers of URM faculty to student ratio that might be really low, We need more of our placed either male and or white allies who are in that discipline to be a part of that mentorship, and that students appreciate, hopefully, given the small numbers, that we can have more than one mentor if possible. So it's a larger systemic issue. So the interinstitutional collaboration is a piece, and also committing funds, which I've seen before at other institutions, to cluster hires and hiring at the associate professor or higher level, so that assistant professors and or underrepresented faculty aren't necessarily burdened with all of the concerns and the research and the advice giving that 2 or 3 Black or brown or women faculty or junior faculty might be burdened with. So it's a larger systemic issue, and certainly my office, with the president's support and the provost support, will be looking at some of these issues, because we've heard this and seen this in the data as well.
Great, thank you. Alex?
All right, let's hear from Rose Kendig from Academic Affairs, I think. Rose, is that right?
Well, I'll be with Empower. I actually start Monday, so I'm a brand new employee, and so hello.
Hello.
Letting me ask a question. I was wondering if Diane could recommend a book or resource on understanding and recognizing unconscious bias.
All right, so the book that Alex mentioned earlier, although it's not only about unconscious bias, deals with higher education and diversity. So Damon Williams' book, I think, is a great start for diversity leadership, and training on unconscious bias is a part of that. So it's Damon A. Williams, Strategic Diversity Leadership. And I want to say the book is by Wing Su, and the title is slipping me right now, but it's about being an other and feeling people being othered and out of place and having bias. First name, I want to say Albert. So those are some of the resources, and the American Association of Colleges and Universities, AACU, has some resources there on equity in higher education, bias in higher education, and the kinds of things that we can do to understand that better or differently. And if on the next, when someone else is talking, I can look up Wing Su's book, I'll be happy to get that in the chat as well.
Okay, I do have an anonymous question here. This viewer writes, much of the EDI work is done by trainees and those from underrepresented groups. The work is often not compensated and can conflict with the roles that we're hired to do by the university. How does the university plan to compensate, recognize, and encourage those who are taking on what is now considered extra work?
This is pretty common in higher education. It is changing because of roles like mine and DEI officers and deans of diversity and directors of diversity. So with our institutionalized roles, I'm hoping that we can both bear more weight and support those who are helping to do some of this work. Some of the work that I've seen at UMB, I've really been both surprised and impressed at the level and depth of that work, knowing it was not someone's full-time job. So I do believe it's the role of an office like mine and our DEI officers as colleagues to support and also alleviate some of that burden, because if it's unpaid, it continues to add to that tax that persons who are in minoritized communities often bear. So I think we can do a better job. Thank you for that observation. And those of us with formal institutional roles will need to shoulder more as part of my feedback on that.
All right, if you're ready for another, I want to bring in Jane Algar. Jane, you have a question about the requirements for promotion.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, Dr. Jarrell and Dr. Berthoud. My question really relates to internal promotions. We have had some, excellent folks who have been, they hire and they train new people who come in, and they really are, making things happen for their groups. But due to their education level, they are not able to move into the next level. They should be able, I think they should be able to move into the next level, considering the responsibility that they're bearing in their current positions. How do we get around that when, it's not even on the table just because of the min quals? And we're not talking about, don't take this wrong, like surgeon level min quals. Obviously, those are there, but these are more like in the support roles.
So internal promotions at UNB Is that the question? And how fair and equitable those processes are?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Those
well,
folks are overlooked. They are not. They're just overlooked.
so I know that we are continuing to strengthen our HR area, and I will hope that someone who's an expert can jump in on that. But I know that the ideas of and our practice of promotion and recruitment and everything that's related to equity and fairness is currently being reviewed. So if anyone else wants to respond to some of that, that's as much as I know, and we're committed to continuing to strengthen that.
Jane, good afternoon and welcome. I think my response would be that there are different categories of employees here, and so for faculty, it's quite different from exempt staff, from non-exempt staff. In terms of HR and policies, I think as Diane mentioned, we need to look at that, but we certainly want to have a mind toward recognizing these people and advancing them. But I don't have concrete answers for you. For faculty, I know there's been significant progress in some of the schools. I know the School of Medicine is certainly now promoting people in a much more appropriate manner who are not your typical research track and who are contributing in other ways. Now, a lot of those are education kind of ways as opposed to the kind that you're talking about. But I think APT committees are going to start recognizing those contributions as important to the school as well. I think it's one of those things where we got to keep our pressure up. And I would turn it back to Diane. One of the things that she has been very focused on is metrics. And so that's a metric that my guess is we don't capture. Okay, and it sounds like to me what Jane is making us think about is we should be capturing it. So we need to talk more about how to get at that. Jane, does that get at your question?
Yes, it does. I just would like to hope that this is being looked at, because I do. It's just a little frustrating when you see that, and obviously this is not about me. This is about people who are in our group, and I just think these opportunities. I think it would not be harmful to the group for these folks to be considered for these positions, because they're not even considered. So that's the other part.
Thank you.
Alex?
All right, Shauna Kessler wants to just go back just for a moment about the topic of mentorship and how we can help that. Shauna, are you there? Are you able? I think you're on the phone. Can you join us?
Yes, can you hear?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. I apologize, my video is not working on WebEx, so that's why you can't see my smiling face. I wanted to just ask a quick question. I'm in the Department of Anesthesiology, and I was wondering, in terms of the mentorship, has there been any thought to sending out a survey or an interest poll, kind of eliciting some of those allies for volunteering towards support of the mentorship for minorities in different programs?
So I can start with my connection to the DEI officers, and then since Dr. Jarrell has been in the med school for a while, he would probably know more than I'm still learning here. So Doctors Rivas and Quesada have been talking with me about programs in the med school. So in terms of surveys, I would recommend you're talking with them about that. I know they're very committed to faculty and student mentoring, and I know there's some faculty who are a part of that and also feeling a bit overtaxed because of some of the things we mentioned earlier. So I know there's always application for new funding, and a recent grant was just written in and around some of those kinds of issues. And we're hoping at a campus level to do more around faculty diversity and development, as well as working on building cohorts of diverse faculty so that there can be greater collaboration and networking and support for them, so that in their roles, they're able to function well and collaboratively. So there are some kinds of things that we're thinking about. The specifics of the School of Medicine, I will depend on Doctors Rivas and Quesada to be our contacts there specifically. And then Dr. Jarrell, I don't know if there are kinds of things that mentorship of trainees or faculty that you wanted to mention in the med school.
Well, I wouldn't limit my comments to the medical school. I would do it broadly. You know, when I first came into this office, it was before March the 14th, 2020, and we had a clear plan to start a mentoring system for underrepresented minorities, women, et cetera. And we kind of started down that path, and then, you know, March 14th comes along and suddenly everything gets shut down. So we never really got to fully develop that because we were mostly remote, or at least the non-clinicians were remote. And so Dr. Forbes Berthoud will tell you that we have had, now that we're able to get back together in person, we are developing a plan on how we would develop these kinds of programs at a campus level. And I think it's important to say that some of these should be at the campus level because they will be complementary to the school level. And further, people will develop a network that's not limited just to their school. And I think that would end up being healthy. So that's on the list. And as we get back in person here, those kinds of programs will develop. But I think, as Dr. Forbes Berthoud said in our last meeting, one of the earliest thing is really to do some focus sessions and meet with these groups and find out where their interests are, where their needs are, as opposed to ours proposing that we know the answers. I know we don't know the answers. We need to listen to people and then design it around what is going to be useful to help people survive. For example, it doesn't make sense at the campus level to be mentoring people about how to write a research grant or how to do research. It might make a lot of sense to mentor them in terms of leadership skills, teaching skills, things like that. So I have personally a lot of interest in this, and that's an area that we have definitely agreed to pursue, and we've set money aside to assist with that. Diane, anything you want to add to that?
And that's great, Bruce. And I really want to support and advance a lot of what we've talked about here today. Faculty leadership and mentorship are important areas because that impacts student experience, teaching, research and learning, and what we mentioned earlier about promotion and advancement for staff. They're all a part of the systemic approach. So very good.
And Shauna, before you go, you had a suggestion for a book.
Oh, yes. Just in response to Rose's earlier question, I know the Department of Anesthesiology, we have recently started just cultural competency and reading different books. So we finished one recently that was called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And that really helps address some of those unconscious bias issues that Rose was kind of asking about. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Thanks. And I was looking for the chat, Alex. The author's name is Derald, D-E-R-A-L-D, Wing Sue. Wing as in W-I-N-G and then Sue. Anything by him on microaggressions and so on would be helpful.
All right. I mentioned earlier, you know, the Clint Smith lecture about reconsidering history and looking at, you know, your own history and your university's history. Alan Wagman has a suggestion in that way of thinking. Alan, are you there?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Between the law school and the social work school, there's a park that sits on top of the garage, University Square Park. And what about using that park for displays about the university's Jim Crow history, the 85-year struggle against that history, and then like interactive kiosks where community members, alumni, and current students can make comments about what's going on today, what's successfully being done, what isn't, what problems they see, and as a way to both educate people and give people an opportunity to give feedback to the university about what's right and what's still wrong.
Thank you so much. I think you raised an important point about the key that I hear here is having a public space or forum for people to not just use art, but apply artistic forms to share knowledge. And that specific location, I'm not in a position to promise that space, but certainly the ability for a community to gather, to share, to increase knowledge is something that I think is wonderfully amazing. I've been in the law school. I've seen some of the photographs and the exhibits and the artifacts, and I'm sure something like that would be beneficial for the campus in different areas and different forums.
Yeah, and in terms of that particular space, I know it's always been very dynamic because there's a big parking lot underneath of it. And I know we just finished another construction process to shore things up a little bit more. So I don't know whether that's the right spot. We certainly, though, do have a library and a campus center, both of which are very attuned to this kind of thing. So that might be the way to talk about it for the future. So Diane, maybe we need to bring this up with in one of our future meetings.
Sure, thank you.
All right, we have an anonymous question. The writer writes, how do we get everyone in to truly understand their cultural biases? And how do we get people to participate in these types of forums? Because it seems to me like the people that should watch and learn don't.
It seems that that question comes up in every forum, in every internal, external panel that I've been on, almost every conference. You know, a number of authors write about the level of engagement, the level and intensity and commitment of leadership and followership, if you want to call it that, or community engagement. We start with who we have, and we start with that middle third. There's usually a third that doesn't care and is not engaged, and a third that's somewhat committed, and they're the diehards, the other third. And that's one of the ways to understand organizations. So we start with the middle group, kind of those who could go either way, that are neutral, and all the programs that we have, all the book clubs that we have, and so on, we try to invite another and build capacity in those ways. And then moving from there, in terms of mandating things and making things happen, one of the things that I have seen to be effective is, in addition to the capacity building, to integrate knowledge and competency, if one can call it that, in equity, diversity, and inclusion as part of the evaluative process or the appraisal process for our managers or leaders, for our staff or various employees, right? Thinking about how we treat people, are people advancing in the various groups? These are all ways that we can do that. And we also cannot force people to come to various programs, right? So we make the opportunities available, build a common case of what is just and what brings good working and teaching and learning relationships, and we try to work from there. But I hear your point. It's absolutely a dynamic that's pervasive. Jarrell, you're on mute, I think.
Doesn't say that.
No, okay, there you are.
Oh, Alex, you fixed me?
I fixed you, yeah.
I'm so glad of that. But I forgot what I was saying. To the audience, please make sure that you're getting your questions in, because we want to make sure we get at some of these things. Diane, when you were at UCSD won some awards. And so you must have had your act together there in one way or another. What was sort of the secret of your act being together there?
Okay, let's zoom out a little. There is no perfect institution. My former institution was wonderful, is wonderful, and there was no perfection. We did make a lot of progress. Some of the secret sauce, something we talked about at the President's Symposium, a strong leadership support and structure that builds out from there, right? So the Forbes Award, I think was the highest in diversity for women. I think we're in top 2 for higher education, and then for diversity overall. And some of the things that they measure that my previous institution did quite well at, and we have quite a bit of that here, so maybe we should go up for that in the next few years, is the structure, an office committed to that. They look at, for example, the representation of women and underrepresented groups in leadership, in the cabinet, and at senior levels. Also, there's an employee engagement survey element where people report being satisfied, happy, or having a positive climate, or seeing progress over time, and how decisions are made and how integral equity, diversity, and inclusion are in those decisions for hiring, for recruitment, for the student programs created, for the faculty programs created. So there was not perfection, but there were structures and models around training, development, mentorship, And we created a plan, which I was responsible for doing, all of which indicate signals to the campus, these are important issues. And then we build training around that, and we hire based on what our priorities and our values are related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. We had a 5-point strategic plan, and diversity, equity, and inclusion were named. And that was point number 2. That was second priority of a 5-point priority. And student success was number 1. So it signals to everyone else who wants to work there, here are the kinds of priorities we have in our strategic plan for our campus. And then from there, we build. So yeah, and everything, the money was allocated to that, as well as the hires and the programs and the training and development. A lot of that is already here. So I think we can certainly build and strengthen that.
Well, we've put some resources into your office. Tell us how you plan to use those resources to implement the kinds of programs you want.
Excellent, great question. So far there are 2 new hires that I hope to secure, an executive assistant that helps me to make sure I'm on time for programs like these and where I'm supposed to be, as well as helping with scheduling across and building on a rhythm. And then a director for equity, diversity, and inclusion who will be responsible for some strategic planning, some event planning, project management, relationship building, and working with the various populations with which I've met so far. So as it relates to some of the things that we've mentioned here, like a faculty development program or diversity summit, I've mentioned that in other settings, really bringing people together who are champions for diversity, teachers of diversity, people who want to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Planning a summit takes some time and some effort. So that event planning will be something that staff will be involved in. Very recently, I partnered with the National Center for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion, not I, but through the office. University of Maryland, Baltimore is a member. Are we using our membership? Which means faculty can participate in faculty success programs, mentorship programs, coaching, writing, research. And so we get a discounted rate through them. And so some sponsorship through my office will allow some faculty throughout the schools to be a part of a semester-long program of coaching, mentoring, and interinstitutional learning. So those are some of the kinds of things that we can do. And certainly when it can be in person, part of the resources will be for gathering and conversations, book clubs, and dinners and receptions for faculty, for students, for staff.
Can I jump in with a question? Just something you just mentioned the symposium. You used a fascinating term, which was racial battle fatigue. And I wonder if you talked about this. I've heard other people comment about why so much of the burden for explaining and discussing and pushing EDI issues falls, on people of color. And it's not, is that what you meant, or is it more than that?
So what you've just described about the labor that falls on people of color or any minoritized group is what we've called, both formally and informally in the research, minority tax. And so just as you pay an additional tax on something to go to the state or whatever it is, in this sense, it's the additional labor that minoritized communities, particularly women and other racial or ethnic or other minoritized groups, bear to tell, to share, to collaborate, to do work on behalf of a particular group. So that's minority tax. That's a great distinction to make. Racial battle fatigue is about that cumulative effect of the psychological, emotional labor and hurt and stress that comes with racial or racialized micro or macro aggressions. And, in any given day, it could be something in the pharmacy, and then maybe you had to go back to the doctor's office to pick up something. Maybe you had to get your child at school, and then you come to work. And so you might be ignored, called a name, somebody doesn't quote, see you in line, or somebody assumes that you're there to serve coffee when you're the keynote or something like that. People describe those as micro, some describe them as macroaggressions. And so by noon, when it's time for lunch at the conference, you're going, I've had it. And so the battle that you have to do, actually, I'm not the person who's doing this. And if I were, may I be treated with some respect? There might have been a negative experience at the pharmacy. If you're a faculty member, you have an experience with someone thinking you don't know what you know, or are you really the faculty member who's teaching this course, type of thing. So those types of experiences cumulatively, even in a day, add up and cause quite a bit of fatigue. I mean, the research does show that this affects sleep, stress levels, it can lead to hypertension and cardiac issues, among other things. So that's RBF, racial battle fatigue.
Good answer. There are a few things around here beside that that cause hypertension, I'm sure, too.
Well, I didn't want to get into all of those. I'll leave the medical stuff to
Lots
you,
of
but
stress.
that's as much as I know with my
Lots of
sociopsychological
stress.
background.
Lots of stress. So, Alex, you got any other questions right this second?
Not at the moment. You've got a very either captivated or shy audience.
I've never heard a
Probably just
shy
answering
audience.
I know.
You often think about you have your job and you have your home, and you must have some outside interests. Tell us about the person, Diane, a little bit.
Oh my. Yes, in a job like this or in leadership, period, one has to have a life outside of work. So I love nature, and no surprise, I lived in California for 11 years. Woohoo! So I love nature, and since I've been here, and even before I moved from here, I love nature walks. Although I'm not a fast runner, I took up running when my son was a baby, and he's going to be 16. I ran my first 5K, I think, was he born 2006, I think it was. That year, I did the Susan G. Komen one, the global race, and I am not here to race anyone. I am not watching my time. I finished. That much I know. I am steady and I am sure, but I am not Usain Bolt or any of the greats on the track, right? So I love to do that and walk, and I love nature. And so I have come to appreciate again the beauty here, love California and love the oceans and all that, but it's dry and it's brown. They called it the Golden State. But here I'm like, oh yeah, I remember how green Maryland is. So I take my time in Patasco State Park, which is not far from where I live. And 2-3 times a week, I get out there doing that, or some other things around the neighborhood, just enjoying that. I love the movies. I'm dying to get back to, since COVID, I missed the movies. I'm a musician as well. We talked about that a little before I got on. I've played piano for many years from when I was a child, and studied voice a little bit. None of my children are musicians, but that's okay. You kind of get over yourself. They get to pick their own things. So yeah, and I love my family a lot. My parents, my dad's going to be 80 next week, and I'm all into my family and my friends and support groups. So I love socializing, and I love to cook, and I love food. So that's a little bit about me outside of work. It's what I do when I'm not churning the midnight oil, if you will, the daytime oil.
I don't think we would have ever talked about that before COVID. You're here to work. But COVID came along, and suddenly these things, they were always important. We just never maybe appreciated, recognized, discussed the other important parts of people's lives. And
Very
so
true.
it's nice to hear what you're doing. You didn't tell one thing that I think you should tell people. You
Yeah.
studied music in London for a while.
So there's a program that I was very privileged to be a part of. Their program actually came to our community and our school, and it's through the Royal Schools of Music. So they have an 8+ year program that some children had a chance to be a part of through their schools. And somehow I studied all the way up to the highest grade and thought about, before going to college, doing a certificate. It's called LRSM, the London Royal Schools of Music certificate. And I went to college instead. Some people do that as part of their collegiate studies. So, it's always with me, always in me. And I'm glad that my parents allowed me that opportunity and made a bit of a sacrifice so my sister and I could do that. One of my sisters did it partially, I went through. And it has, music has informed my life quite a bit, studying music theory and voice. I have some STEM family members who study math and physics, and they like to give these lectures about math being a language. Well, I give my lecture about music being a language. It's a language that I find that connects people. Whether you speak that particular language or not, you hear something, there's a rhythm moving, you can smile at each other. I went years ago to a wedding of a friend in Europe with not many of us speaking the same language. But there were some songs that came on that, even though they were in English, I was like, how do they know that song, right? So there was Bob Marley playing, or a rock band, or Mick Jagger or something, and I'm going, what is going on here? And they knew every word, but didn't speak English, right? But there was a connection among us on the dance floor going, oh my gosh, you know that song, you're gonna sing One Love, or we're gonna sing one of these other songs. And so, I mean, that's just one of those examples, but even, the music, the European classical music and some of the African things that I had studied, there's a way to connect with people, which I've always loved. And it keeps me going through the day. I have music playing usually when I'm at my computer.
you for that. Alex, you got another question there, I hear.
Well, one thing I'm sure you're already finding out, Diane, is that the people in my office were all a bunch of hopefully former pushy journalists. And so Mary Phelan, one of my colleagues, wants to, hey, we always have questions. So Mary, what's your question?
Thank you, Alex. Hi, Dr. Forbes Berthoud. Thank you for taking my question. Were there some things at your most recent higher ed position that you want to be sure not to bring with you here to UMB? Things that just didn't work well, or you don't want to see repeated, or us head down that particular path? I recognize there are a lot of similarities among different campuses, but if there's something, you know, that you want us to make sure that we don't go down that road. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for that difficult question and that very
No,
complicated
I
question.
said former. I said former. I didn't, you know, hopefully we're
Well, the
reformed
thing is,
journalists.
hi, colleagues. I've studied communication for many years myself, so I am certainly not going to disparage my previous institution, because a lot of the dynamics that we face are not unique to any one institution. So I'll speak to a dynamic rather than an institution, which is some persons may view a role such as a chief diversity officer or somebody in a senior diversity role as a crisis manager or someone who helps with risk mitigation. We do that partially, and that's not the role primarily. So what I found in 2020 and even in 2016, or when there were other crisis points in US history or throughout the world, is people rushed to make a decision or rushed to do something because that was the call of the community, or that was the call of the time. I do not think that is best practice. The work that we're involved in and the work in around EDI advancement, as I mentioned earlier, has to be strategic and thoughtful. Of course, there are times we need to get a statement out tomorrow, or we need to do something within a timely fashion. Absolutely. A plan, steps to moving the needle, so to speak, and all of that takes time, takes discussion, takes deliberation, and takes question and answer, inquiry and investigation. So that's less of a University of California dynamic and more of a human dynamic and a higher education dynamic. We got to do this, we got to do this, let's get it out right now. And then it's not good and it's not effective and people are harmed in the process. So certainly, which is the way I've often worked, is to be thoughtful, to be strategic, to be systematic about what we're doing, and then to work collaboratively, which takes a bit of time. And that is what I hope to continue to bring here.
Alex, other questions?
It's that shy audience. No.
Shy audience. Well, I think we're out of all of our planned things. You know, Diane, I really enjoyed Ibram Kendi when he came here. He just opened up a whole new line of thought for me. And I know you've certainly talked about metrics and the like, but among the things that he talked about was seeking out policies that maybe are perpetuating a bias against a certain group versus another group. And do you have any experience on how do you find those policies? Is it just a systematic review of everything? My gosh, that sounds bureaucratic. Or what? So how do you get to some of those issues?
Well, in terms of thinking of it strategically, I would think about one of the ways to do it. One can do it by division in school and or collaboratively at the same time with population. And so let's just start with staff, because some of the questions we received today are about that. If we think about the life cycle of staff from pre-entry to separation, there's so many things that happen in between, right? From the recruitment and the search to then the interviewing process, the interviewing and all the things that come there, and then hiring, negotiation. At every point, there are a set of policies related to the life cycle of the employee. So the answer to, do we do a review of all these things? The answer is yes. We can figure out what the top priorities are based on the reports we've received, the suggestions we have from advisory councils and senates and so forth. And at the leadership level, certainly of HR and EDI and the president's office, all of us collaboratively thinking, does this work? Do we have an internal promotion policy? What's the staff appraisal process like? How can we be more inclusive in that? And that takes some work of committee and different experts to examine that. So the answer is yes, and there is no quick fix, but we can certainly take one or two things and begin with that. I think Kendi's point is certainly around if we continue on the way we are going, we're just kind of going to end up where we are with a system that's based mostly in, continues to reify or reinforce racial hierarchies, which is what has happened quite a bit in the West, in the United States, in Canada, and in other places. And so stopping and examining what about our hiring needs to change, or what about our tenure and promotion process needs to change? As I mentioned, the research that's valued or not valued. And are we counting publications or looking at the quality of teaching and research? And are we counting the advising? And this is something that ACE, the American Council on Education, has written about, how to be more equitable in course loads and faculty loads. Do we look at the advising loads of faculty, the number of students they advise, the kinds of issues that they deal with that are uncompensated, that then when it's time for tenure are not accounted for, yet they advise most of the racially underrepresented trainees or PhD or master's students. So those are things we actually have to measure to see, does one person have a class prep of maybe 3 courses and another person is prepping for 10 and advises 25 students or something, while the other has 2 and 10 grants and all these other opportunities. We have to measure those kinds of things to think about equity. So long road and many things to examine, and they're a priority, so we need to do that.
A lot of work, but
Mhm.
very important work.
Indeed.
All right, well, we're just about out of time. I enjoyed this discussion immensely. So first of all, I want to thank you for being with us. I want to thank you for coming to Baltimore to begin with.
Of course, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Nice to have you here. I hope you get to meet certainly all the people who are in our audience and continue to make your rounds. But there'll come a time when we need to start doing some things too, won't there?
I know. Let's get the staffed up, and then we're good to go.
And I look forward to that. So with that, Alex, I think that concludes our session. For those of you in the audience, thank you very much yet again for listening in and giving us your questions. So with that, thank you all and see you later.
All right,
Thank you,
take care.
everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.